Welcome back to the History of the Papacy Podcast, a podcast about the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I am your host, Steve Gura, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. Hey everybody, it's Steve here. I recorded this episode about maybe 2 days ago, and a lot has changed since that recording. We do have a new pope, Pope Leo XIV, who was former Cardinal Robert Prevost, who is the first American pope, or who is the first American pope. We'll get into a lot of the details about this future pope. We'll probably do an episode on this Cardinal Perlin, where he came from. There's a lot of interesting details with his life. We probably won't get into a tremendous amount of detail because there's just so much new information coming out about him. But related to this episode that I recorded before, and I think this you should definitely hang on all the way to the end because it's so interesting. This whole episode was based around the prediction markets around who would be pope. And I said it in this episode, and I've said it many times. Prediction markets are very accurate in some ways, but I think that it was very inaccurate with this current pope, and just it would be inaccurate with popes in general because it's such a unique election in that the only data points are the 140 cardinals who go in, or the X amount of cardinals, we'll say, in future conclaves. And we just don't know what the politics are. We don't 100% know what the politics are going in, and we know basically 0% of what political machinations went on in that conclave. It must have been fascinating because of how quickly they came up with him. It was less than 5 ballots to get Cardinal Prevost to become Pope Leo XIV. It's one of the shortest conclaves of all times, only 2 days to get white smoke. So I think that that is fascinating. So definitely keep listening, and let's see a little bit of how these markets worked. I'll just say that going in, Cardinal Perlin was up to 67%, and Prevost was pretty low down there. I don't even think he was on my radar at all. He was on the poly market in the under 5%. So this will be definitely an interesting papacy to watch out for with this young pope, relatively young, not super young, 69 for an elected leader or of any sort or stripe in this era. That's young. So let's check out and think a little bit more about these markets. Today, I'm going to address some of the top contenders for the next pope. I'm not going to get too much into the detail of each of these cardinals because, again, there's 140 of them. All of them are in play as to be the next pope. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a little different tack than our friends over at Pontifex or Popular History. Definitely tune into both of them because they are doing continued coverage as well. Way I'm going to look at it today is I want to look at some of what are these cardinals who are meeting in conclave looking for in the next pope. And then what I'm also going to look at is the poly market prediction market website. And what the poly market is people literally put their money where their mouth is. They put, I guess what you might call wagers, or they're maybe investing in their own money on who they think the next pope is. Honestly, most of these people, they're not going to have any more insider information than you or I do. They're just predicting who they think the next pope is. And what I think is valuable about Polymarket is this website was more accurate in the 2024 presidential election than any of the polling. And generally, Polymarket is very accurate, especially as it gets closer and closer to the actual event, the more accurate it becomes. Again, there's some problems with the nature of the conclave process, because once they're in conclave, these 140 cardinals, a lot of politics breaks down when they're face to face and they're horse trading inside of the conclave. Somebody could be up in the ballots, but they're just not hitting that number. And then the whole conclave starts to switch, and they could do a 180 turn. That person who on the first initial ballots could have been the top contender, and then they start to lose steam and it starts swinging towards somebody else. That can very easily happen when these cardinals are on lockdown. Could this be a quick conclave, or could it be a long drawn out affair? We just don't know at this time. Now, before we get too far into the actual who are our top contenders as on Polymarket, let's talk a little bit about what these cardinals are actually looking for and what are some of the factors at play. This really is the chess, the 3D chess, the 5D chess, if you will, of a conclave. What some of the factors that they're looking for is regionality. Is it going to be somebody from Europe, inside of Europe? Is it an Italian or a Southern European versus the Germans, who have a really powerful bloc? Are they looking for somebody who is theologically driven from a certain bent? Are they a moderate theologically? Are they liberal? Are they conservative? Are they a moderate, conservative, or liberal politically? And that politically charged moderatism or liberalism or conservatism can very much change whether they are, depending based on what region they're from. And then another factor, of course, is the person's age. Are they looking for a pope that is younger or older? Are they looking for somebody who could be a placeholder? Pope Francis was pope for a long time. He made a lot of changes. Are they looking for that cardinal who will become pope, who's going to be pretty much status quo? Are they going to be a Francisite, so to speak, and continue his reforms and his changes and his policies? Or are they going to look for somebody who's anti-Francis, who's going to go back on a lot of the things that he's done? Then there's it's sort of the X factor. Most of the popes who are real contenders are all Latin, meaning that they're Roman, and they're of that bent. But there's also these so-called sui juris or sui juris churches that are self-governing autonomous churches within the Roman Catholic Church. They're generally on the outside, they would look like an Eastern Orthodox or an Oriental Orthodox, but they're not in communion with the Orientals or the Eastern Orthodox, but externally they look like them and they have a lot of the same theological bents. None of these guys are really in the running, but it could be interesting that they wind up going with one of these. It's kind of a way outsider possibility, but it's not impossible. So let's just talk about region quickly. Regions, we have the United States. We have South America, Europe, and then Africa and the East, China, and China really being that 800-pound gorilla in the room. Generally speaking, the African cardinals are much more theologically conservative than maybe your European cardinals. You've got South America, who many of their cardinals are much more liberal politically and more liberal on the theological bent. America, a real mixed bag. You have some very conservatively political and conservatively theological cardinals mixed in with some very liberal on both political and theological issues. Europe, again, a mixed bag, but generally more liberal theologically and a mixture of liberal conservative politically. Now, talking about theologically, you have your conservatives, your liberals, and your moderates. And your moderates, it's not like they're 50-50. A lot of times they don't have they haven't drawn stark lines, either liberal or conservative, or they do have a mixed bag of both opinions. As far as somebody liberally theologically, they're going to be people who are more for remarriage, which was always a big no-no in the Catholic Church, where if you got divorced and your marriage wasn't annulled in an official church capacity, these these lay people who were married and divorced were not allowed to get communion. They were essentially excommunicated. So there's a lot of cardinals who want to liberalize that. You have liberals who want to be ecumenical, meaning they want to have strong ties and maybe even form communion again with some of the Protestant groups or some of the Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox churches. They want much tighter connections with these other churches that are not in communion with Rome. Conservatively minded cardinals want to be much stricter on those issues, and they don't want to necessarily have stronger ecumenical relationships with the other churches, or if the other churches want to have relations with the Catholic Church, they're going to have to become Catholic and fall in line with Catholic Church dogmas. There's this big issue of the ordination of women. Liberals are leaning more towards the ordination of women, maybe not full-blown priests, but maybe women deacons. The conservatives are really against that. Then you have the issue of the Latin Mass, and the Latin Mass is a huge issue. Pope Francis, the Council of Vatican II, all the way back in the 60s, kind of dialed back and went back on the traditional Latin Mass. And what we should really say is the traditional Latin Mass is not just saying the Mass in Latin. There's a whole environment around that, where the people who are into the traditional Latin Mass have certain political views, certain theological views. Popes later on, after Vatican II, started to give the Latin Mass a little bit more consideration. John Paul II loosened up and allowed more groups to do this Latin Mass. And then Pope Benedict loosened it a lot more. But Pope Francis really pulled back the reins on how much the Latin Mass was allowed, and he fairly much banned it except for certain groups and certain circumstances. Hey, Steve here. If you're enjoying the History of the Papacy podcast, consider joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/history of the papacy. We're working toward going completely listener funded, which means no more ads ever. When you join, you get early access to episodes, monthly book giveaways, and most importantly, your name is added to the History of the Papacy Diptychs, our own list of commemorated supporters. You can become an Antioch level supporter for just $3 per month, but it makes a huge difference to making the history of the papacy ad-free and independent. Nobody likes ads, not you, not me, and I'm the guy who records them. So let's just get rid of them. Visit patreon.com/history of the papacy and join today. Now, politically speaking, that's a whole different ball of wax. Like I said, regionally, that's going to change a lot because a conservative in Europe is going to look a lot different than a conservative from, say, the United States and what they believe in. Another big issue is on abortion. Generally speaking, abortion is an excommunicatable offense. If somebody gets an abortion, you're out, and there's not a lot of options to get back in. Your more liberally inclined prelates and cardinals would be willing to give women who have had an abortion an option to get back into the church. Then we have this age issue. And age is it can be complicated because popes do not have to resign. So a cardinal could be right on the cusp of that 80-year-old of where they're no longer papable, but that cardinal could be 79 and 364 days old, get elected pope, and still have a good 10 years or more left in them and could still make a lot of changes. But then again, you have cardinals who are in their 50s. They could have a 20-year reign, no problem, and be very transformative. You could have a cardinal get picked who's very administrative minded and doesn't want to make these big changes and all these different issues that are at play. We're talking about each single category that I've laid out, five different categories, that they could be all over the place on these. And inside of the conclave, they could be looking for somebody who's a little bit of this, a little bit of that. It could just get down to the fact that as the ballots start rolling out, they could go to somebody altogether who's not any of these, and the cardinals could go for somebody who's in a way opposed to them on many of the issues, just because of the way this balloting inside of the conclave breaks down. There's probably going to be a lot of impetus for them to make it a conclave short, like just let's boom, boom, boom and get it done with. There could be, but they could also get drawn out and it could take months. We just don't know. Pope Francis was a very quick conclave, not many ballots, but that doesn't necessarily mean the way it could play out in this current conclave. There's just so many factors at play. Then there's also the issue, a big issue that in a lot of ways Pope Francis punted on. He talked a big game, but he didn't do much with the huge issue of the child sex abuse scandal that's really been rocking the church since the 60s, but it's really played out during Francis's reign. And Francis, in word, took a very hard line, but then he didn't do much. And a lot of cardinals who are sitting in conclave right now have very questionable backgrounds on what they actually did to fight against this major scandal. Some of the cardinals were very loose on who they clamped down on, of priests that were known to have been essentially predators. And some cardinals came down hard on them. Just another issue at hand. Now, getting into who were the guys who are in the top on Polymarket, we have Pietro Parolin. He's the top contender right now by far on Polymarket. He is coming in at 29% chance. There's over $1 million in play at his election. You can buy a share in Cardinal Perlin at 29 cents US. He's youngish at 70 years old. He's an Italian. He's all of these cardinals. The thing you can really say is that they're all insiders. They all have top jobs. They are top. They're really ingrained into the whole administration of the church. You can't really be a cardinal without doing that. He is the Cardinal Bishop of Santi Simone Giada Taddeo a Torre Angela as his official post. He's also a member of the Council of Cardinal Advisors, and he's had a bunch of jobs. He was consecrated. He's actually one of the rare cardinals that was put in place by Pope Benedict. So he's been around, even though he's only 70 years old. Most of the vast majority of the cardinals were actually appointed by Francis at this point. So this Pietro Parolin, he is definitely one to keep your eye on. Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors. The next one on the list is coming in at 18% with well over $1.1 million in volume, trading volume. So he's being heavily traded, is Luis Antonio Tagle, and he is a Filipino cardinal. He seems to lean a little bit more on the theologically and politically liberal side, just from, real broad strokes. And he is very young, coming in at 67 years old. And he's probably what you could really call as a Francisite. And I think if he became Pope, he would definitely continue Francis's reforms and Francis's policies going forward. And somebody like him, you could see easily a 20-year reign out of somebody like him, maybe 25-year reign, somebody who's only 67 years old. Then we have coming in just a few percent lower, Matteo Zuppi. He's coming in at about $800,000 in volume on Polymarket. He's another Italian. He's straight from Rome. Again, young at 69 years of age. He's the Bishop of Bologna, which is a powerful Italian episcopate. Again, I mean, these guys, they're every single one of the top contenders' resumes are totally insiders inside of the papal, the curia and the administrative arm of the papacy. He's definitely another liberal who on political issues for sure. And again, he's another one who's probably would very much continue a lot of Francis's policies. Then you have coming in at 9%. So these top four that I've mentioned, they're taking up about 70% of Polymarket. Turkson is an African pope, or he's an African cardinal, Archbishop of Cape Coast in Africa. Again, full resume of all these jobs inside of the curia. A lot of these, it's very interesting amongst the African cardinals. Cardinal Sarah is another one who he's a little bit lower on the list, only coming in at 3%, where Turkson is in at 9%, but with a lot of trading volume of over $1 million in volume. The African cardinals are of particular note because Catholicism is just exploding in Africa, and it's bringing in a lot of new converts who are converting from either different Protestant groups or from the native African religions, but they're bringing in a lot of new converts. So that's something to watch, because you're really in an expansion mode. So they have to make certain compromises with native and internal politics in Africa, as well as the particular needs of these new groups of people who are coming into the church, who have their own beliefs, but are with an evangelistic faith. Some are, when they become Catholics, they're going to be very much, they want to follow the letter of the law, but also they have their own thoughts on issues. And because they are growing so much, they're a force to be reckoned with. And I think that it's not impossible that they could go with an African cardinal, just because this is such a powerful and growing bloc. And then the last pope coming in the last potential pope is Pier Battista Pizzaballa, who is an Italian. Again, he's leaning in some ways towards the conservatives, but also the liberals. He's kind of a moderate, but he's really big into interfaith dialogue, or ecumenical relationships between the different churches. Now, another huge issue that I didn't mention is where cardinals are falling on some of the big hot button issues. And two of the big hot button international issues in 2025 is the Russo-Ukrainian war, which really pits, in a lot of ways, Catholicism versus Eastern Orthodoxy, because we could get into a lot of issues here. Western Ukraine is largely Roman Catholic. Eastern Ukraine is largely, especially amongst the Russian population, Russian Orthodox, with deep ties to the Russian Orthodox Church under the Patriarch Kirill. Then stuck in the middle are what the Eastern Orthodox would call uniates, but they're these the self-governing churches that would on the outside look Eastern Orthodox, but are actually in communion with Rome, and they're stuck in the middle. But then you also have Eastern Orthodox, who are a part of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that's split away from the Russian Orthodox Church. They're accepted by some Eastern Orthodox, but not accepted by the Russian Orthodox. So that's a huge issue going on. The popes of Rome have been sort of leaning more towards the breakaway Ukrainian Orthodox Church and against the Russian Orthodox Church inside of Ukraine. Huge political issue. Then you have the whole fight in the war that's currently going on in Gaza. Now that mostly focuses, most of the Gazan people are Muslim, but there's a significant Christian population, and many of them are tied to the Eastern Orthodox Church. So beyond the religious issues, there's also the humanitarian issues for the Muslims and the Christians inside of Gaza. All issues that we're going to have to look at, that we look at as outsiders, not sitting inside of the conclave, issues that many Catholics find very important to them, be it revolving around the Russo-Ukrainian war and the war that's currently going inside of Gaza. Very important to many people sitting inside of that conclave, the cardinals and the priests, laity, everybody who's outside of the conclave. All issues that we should be looking at and thinking about, and that these cardinals will certainly be looking at. So this is my little take on what to look for in the conclave, and definitely send in your comments and look for more coverage of Conclave 2025 coming up soon. I will talk to you next time.
The Historical Jesus Podcast is the sweeping saga of the life and times of Galilean Jesus of Nazareth, as well as the faith, religion, and church founded to honor and disseminate his acts and teachings. Join me, Mark Vinette, on this fascinating journey through time, exploring the many great works of Christian theology, literature, architecture, music, and art inspired by the words and deeds of Jesus Christ.